video is a summary of the much longer basic photo editing tutorial that's on my website. In this one, I want to cover just some of the decisions that I make when I process a photo. When I'm editing my photos, some of them are very natural, and some of them I push a little bit further to make them more surreal. And I would like to explain a little bit further, what happens behind the scenes when you're making a decision about how should I edit this photo, what would be most impactful here. There are some principles at play. Rather than just showing you here's what this slider does and here's how to make this look, I want to talk about some of those decisions that go into editing each photo. And they also apply when you're shooting at the point of capture. So these are things that you can use all through your photo workflow. Why would you want to process your photos at all in the first place? So when you're taking photos specifically with a phone, or even a lot of times with an advanced camera, you might be just leaving that in JPEG mode, or just capturing a standard photo without doing any kind of processing to it, which is what you would do if you're capturing a RAW photo. And when you pull the RAW photos into your computer for the first time, they're going to look something like this. Especially when you start shooting in RAW, you're going to have to do some basic corrections to every photo. If your camera is shooting in JPEG, it is applying its own recipe, its own processing to the photo to analyze and turn it into a usable image. So if you are shooting in RAW, it's applying no processing. It's just saying, let's capture the information in front of the sensor, send it directly to your memory card, and then you as the photographer decide how you want to tone that. So I stopped and photographed this scene because I saw something here. I saw layers and textures and shapes. This is midday. There's not a lot interesting here in terms of the depth of field because of the light or the textures or anything like that. But I thought I can make something interesting out of this. And this is the whole point of learning to post-process your photos, because you would normally see a scene like this and go, oh, there's nothing interesting there. But I knew that I could make something like this out of it. As you get further into processing your photos, you'll come across everyday scenes that at first glance, maybe you're not that interesting, but because you've spent a little bit of time learning how to manipulate those photos after you've taken them, you realize, hey, there's something cool here. I can really do something with all of those cool shapes and the depth of field here in the hills and all of the darks and the lights and the way that the light is hitting the hills. I can manipulate that in a fun and cool way. So this is the number one reason that we take these photos in RAW and then we put them on our computer and we process them later. Here's a good example actually of one of those photos where I didn't do any kind of drastic changes to it. I just made some small edits. So this was the RAW file out of my camera, and then I realized, you know what? That horizon line looks like it's off. It's not quite level, and I've got just some dust spots up there on my sensor. I want to clean that up a little bit, kind of fix the color tones in it, and just make it feel a little bit more inviting. So just with those two examples that I showed you there, you can do either something that's just a basic edit that you need to do just to clean up an image, or you can take it a little bit further and do something like this where you say, I'm going to take an everyday scene and make it something that's a little bit more dramatic and really draw people into it. Second point on the list here, photo processing softwares do the same exact things in very different ways. What do I mean by that? So I'm just going to grab one here, open in Camera Raw. This is a photo processing software that comes with your Adobe Lightroom and Adobe Photoshop tools. And the first thing that it opens up to is a panel here that has a lot of the same settings that you might see in your phone processing software. So just looking at this window here, I see my exposure, my contrast, highlights, shadows, whites, blacks, texture, clarity. Dehaze is something that's kind of unique to Adobe products. Let's flip the page over here. I'm just looking now at iOS or Apple Photos processing software. This is the kind of software that you would have on your phone just for processing a snapshot that you took. And we see pretty much the same settings up here: brilliance, exposure, highlights, shadows, brightness, contrast, black point. You'll notice that they call them something different, and they do behave just slightly differently. So you're not going to be able to flip between softwares and have them behave exactly the same, because they all have slightly different algorithms, slightly different software processing behind them, but they all do roughly the same things. And then when we get further into some of the details here, so this is the curves blending layer. This is how you're going to sharpen it in Camera Raw. HSL adjustments, you'll hear me refer to this a few times throughout the video. That just means hue, saturation, luminance. Let's flip over here to Apple Photos. curves layer, levels, HSL corrections down here, hue, saturation, luminance. So Adobe Camera Raw is a very advanced photo editing tool. This is a tool that's been around for a long time. As you can see, it has a lot of different granular editing tools up here. But when you flip through all of the tools, they're doing roughly the same things that Apple Photos interface is doing. Now, I'm going to get into a little bit later in this video some of those specifics that you can do with a more powerful editing tool like Camera Raw, like Photoshop, like Lightroom. But if you are just looking to get started and get a feel for what can I do with my photos, all you need is a basic free software. You don't need to pay for an Adobe photography license and learn to use Photoshop and Lightroom and all of these special tools. You can use something that comes free. Okay, let's keep moving here. What order of corrections should I make when I start processing my photos? We start off with the basic corrections just for any errors that you have with your camera and your lens. Those are in some softwares, not necessarily in every software. And then we do white point, black point, obvious temperature corrections. So like if you're photographing a city at night, a lot of times the lights create a little bit of a challenge for your camera to figure out with the white balance. So they'll come out blue. So you may have to make some obvious temperature correction adjustments there. Then we move into general universal corrections, which is just our highlights, shadows, texture, dehaze, contrast, sharpness, those basic settings that we saw in each of the photo softwares that I just pulled up for you. And if you're just getting into some processing, that may be where you stop. You're just going to do step 1 and 2 there, and that's it. That's good for you. The next step that you might take would be to start doing some zone edits or selective edits, where you pick out different parts of the image that you want to bring forward and draw people's attention to. So you might do some dodge and burn, which means brightening or darkening certain parts of the image. You might sharpen just one part of the image, and you might add a vignette to it. So these are all different types of edits that we're doing to direct people's attention to specific things within the photo. And then before we output it and make our final image, we might do some specific sharpening. We might do some specific denoise. We might do a few things just to make it ready for large viewing. If you're only outputting photos to view on social media, then you probably don't need to worry about this. You're probably stuffed with step 2 in the first place. But if you're ready to, again, go to that next level, kind of dive deeper, figure out, how creative do I want to get with my photos? How much time do I want to spend editing them? I definitely recommend going through all of the steps and determine at what point does it make sense for you to keep going and keep learning, or at what point, are you satisfied? And that's it. That's good for you. Before we continue on with the photo processing steps, I want to touch on a summary here of how to direct a viewer to what you want them to look at in an image. I've got a longer video that's all about directing viewer attention. Here I'm going to just do that by looking at a few example images. So this one, we're looking at the brightest point in the image. And this is the photo out of the camera. I made this edit to it to tell you, I want you to look up here over the dune. So obviously you're going to follow the footsteps up here. You can tell that this is closer to you because that footstep is larger, and then they get smaller as they go up the dune. And then we've got some dark pixels back here in the background. That's to distract your eye or detract your eye from going back there. I want to pull your eyes back here into the brightest point in the image. And you'll see a lot of photographers do this, where they add brightness into the center of their image, and then they add darker pixels on the outside in order to keep your eye in the center of the image or going towards the main point of focus that they want to draw your attention to. The next would be the sharpest pixels in the image. Now, we do this a lot by use of a shallow depth of field or high f-stop, meaning an f2 to an f3.2, 3.5, something like that. In this case, I really wanted to photograph this wood that this man was working on, but he didn't want his face in the photo. So I took a few photos, I turned the camera on and showed it to him to show him that he was blurred. I was just taking a picture of the piece of wood that he was working on. And he smiled. He was happy with me taking that photo. So I stood there and took a few more. And I did this this is your brightest point in the image still. Also, the sharpest pixels in the image. Now, we want to include this up here. I don't want to crop it out because it gives you a lot of context for where I am, what's happening here, why am I taking a photo of this. So we want to include that, but really the point of interest is right here, and your eyes go right to that when you start to look at this image. In this one, I did both together. So we've got the brightest pixels in the image right here at the front of the car, as well as the sharpest pixels in the image. Now, It's not the sharpest. If you zoom in, the front of this car is a little bit blurry. I didn't get it perfectly tack sharp, but obviously that's still the point of interest because everything else in the photo is blurry. I was moving my camera and panning with the car as it was going past me, and I was able to get this star effect on the headlamp there as well. I did a few little edits to this when I put it into my computer, but really this is pretty much out of the camera just this way. These rules don't just apply to editing your photos. These also apply to when you're in the field capturing these things. These are the points that you want to think about. You can only push a photo so far when you're doing edits to it. You have to have put those elements into your frame in the first place when you were capturing it. This is going to be the point of highest color contrast in the photo as well as the brightest point in the image. So this was the photo again, straight out of camera. I felt like, the story really is the hut up there in the background. So how am I going to draw your attention to that? So this is the edit that I made to it. Darken down the exterior of the photo here by use of a vignette and some dodging and burning, which we'll talk about. And then added a little bit of brightness and some color contrast to the rocks here. You can see in the original image, there's a little bit of color there, but I really pulled that out when I did the edit to it. And then also the brightest point in the image, of course, is this hut up there in the background. So I'm drawing your eyes up there by giving your eyes a path to follow, kind of a leading line down here in the beginning of the photo. And then the highest point of color contrast up there. So I wanted you to feel like you're on the outside looking in, and this row of trees serves as a framing element, but then I'm leading you up to my element that's there in the background. And this is another concept that we kind of use by layering the lights and the darks. So your eyes are going to go to the point that's the brightest in the image, right? And then they're going to go to the darkest point in the image, and the sharpest pixels in the image are probably actually down here in the foreground. That's what your eyes can make out the best. So this is another physiological trigger. Your eyes want to go between the alternating lights and darks. So we've got a little bit of darks down here in the beginning, and then a lights layer, darks, lights, darks again in the sky. And that's my way of layering this scene to tell you, hey, there's some depth here. This is a landscape. This is a place that you could visit in real life. So that's your way of taking a 2D photo and placing it in the real world by layering those lights and darks through your image to draw people's eyes through the image, as well as to create a sense that, hey, this is occurring in the real world. This isn't a flat image. And this is an example of removing distractions from your photo. So I took a bunch of different images here because these boats were interesting to me, but I didn't know what I wanted to do with them. And when I was reviewing these later, I found this frame in my photos that had these 3 birds positioned very nicely. Now, I didn't do that on purpose. That was just pure luck, but that was very interesting. So you'll notice, first of all, I removed the distraction of the power lines here in the sky. And then when I was editing, I added a lot of color contrast and a little bit of sharpness to the boats down here. But really, to me, you don't know exactly what I want you to look at here. So that was a problem. I wanted to take this just a little bit further. So I was figuring out, what do I want to do with that? Well, these birds over here don't add a lot. Could I take those out? And then over here, there's a couple of cell phone towers that sort of remove the mystery and the mystique about where I am and what's going on here. So I just cropped those out. And honestly, I think the vertical edit of this works a little bit better too, because you take in the boats down here in the foreground and then wander up and look at those birds in the sky, but then your eyes come back down here to the point of highest color contrast and sharpness. So the vertical edit, I think, directs your attention a lot better, whereas here, your eyes don't really know where to rest or what to look at. So that's why we crop out a lot of information as well. So those are the 5 critical points really for how do you direct a viewer's attention? And you got to think about those things when you take your photo, but really, these are things that I'm considering as I'm editing a photo to say, is it successful? When I'm showing this to the viewer, am I accomplishing these things with my photo edit? So far, we've looked at the principles about what makes a good photo edit, and those are things that you might use as well when you're capturing your photos. And then why do we edit the photo? Let's look now at actually doing the edit on a photo. Do this first in Apple Photos and then over in Lightroom, so you can see the difference between a basic photo editing software and then a more powerful one that a lot of professionals use. There are dozens and dozens of them out there. If you look here, just from Apple Photos, I've got several other options of photo softwares that I could launch and edit in. as well. So if you do buy some other plugins and you're used to using Apple Photos for your library, just to organize your personal photos, you can get to those other photo softwares a lot of times straight through Apple Photos. But anyway, that's something I cover a lot more in detail as well, other photo editors and what they do differently in the longer photo editing tutorial if you're curious about that. Let's go ahead here in Apple Photos and do our basic corrections. We'll start with blacks, whites, shadows, highlights, and then temperature corrections and any other obvious basic corrections. And I'm going to run through this kind of quickly, and then we'll spend a little bit of time at the end after the Lightroom edit with some common editing problems, some common challenges, if you will. All right. So what are all of these sliders referring to here in your photo? First of all, let's look at the histogram. If you're not familiar with histogram, ta-da! This means that this is all of the information in your photo. On the left edge is your black point. On the far right edge is your white point. This is your highlights. In the middle is your midtones. Right here is your shadows. And the best way I can use to demonstrate this, I just drew a gradient going from white to black across this image, and it's got several different color tones in it. So I've got a black, blue, green, red layer in there. And when you draw that across, you're going to have a midtone, a highlight, a white point, a shadow, a black point of each of those tones. So this is the best way that my mind got around when I edit my photos. What am I playing with when I adjust the shadows? Well, I'm adjusting everything in this area of the image that's not a true black point and it's not a midtone. And then highlights, similar. It's not a white point and it's not a midtone. White points, when you adjust that, it's just right here, the very brightest pixels in the image. Similar black point. When you adjust black point, just the darkest pixels in the image are being adjusted. Let's go ahead and do some of these edits over here in Apple Photos. Brilliance is kind of their white point slider. Highlights, usually we drop the highlights a little bit so that we're not, overblown or overexposed in the sky. Now you see if I push it too far, it breaks that cloud there. It draws hard lines between those tones in the cloud. Personally, I don't like that. I think that feels unnatural. You're never going to walk outside and look up at the clouds. It's going to look like that, where you've got those hard lines between those tones. So if you do, then I don't know, maybe something's wrong with you or something's wrong with me. Could be. Shadows, usually we raise those a little bit. Don't raise them too far. That feels unnatural. It kind of feels like, ooh, there's some nice sunlight going on there. But you lose some of the detail down here. And that, again, just is not something that you're ever going to really see in the real world. A little bit of shadows is good. We don't want to remove them all. All right, brightness. I usually rarely play with this unless it's obviously underexposed or overexposed. Black point. This is saying I want fewer true black pixels in my image. I want more true black pixels in my image. And this is usually what somebody will do if they're doing a vintage style edit that makes a photo look kind of like it's washed out or like it's a printed photo that faded over time. So you might reduce the black point so it looks like it's a little bit faded. Also, on almost every photo editor I've ever used, if you double click on a label or a slider, it'll take it back to 0. So that's a quick way to undo any of those edits that you made. Here I'm going to raise my black point just a tiny little bit. The other basic correction here is contrast. Now pay attention to this histogram down here when I play with contrast. If I move it up, you can see that it's pushing the information out towards the edges. It's moving that information out of the midtones into the highlights and the shadows. So we talked about directing viewer attention. The color contrasts are something that people's eyes are drawn to. Contrast in general creates separation between the whites and the blacks, allowing people's eyes to first go to the brightest point in the image, then go look at the darkest point in the image, and then step back and look at the color contrast. Well, a little bit of contrast here is good. We don't want to overdo it. Again, when it starts to feel unnatural, pull it back. All right. There's one more basic correction here that I need to do, and I want to retouch and get rid of a couple of these dust spots and little things that are on the image. With, again, every photo editor, not everyone, but most of them, if you hit the right bracket tool on your keyboard, that'll make your brush bigger. Left bracket tool makes it smaller. Pretty simple. So this did a nice job there with the dust spot in the sky. I saw a couple more over here. There's one little one. There's a dust spot up there. Dust spots are just stuff that gets on the sensor inside of your camera. And my Sonys are particularly bad about that. They like to grab dust out of the environment. And that's the easiest way to clean them up right there. I try and do that in the field when I'm shooting, but sometimes they get in the photo anyway. Got to go back and clean them up later. So there we go. Now, there's a guy standing down here, and he doesn't contribute anything to the image. He's taking a picture of something off scene. So I want to try and remove him with this tool. Yuck. That doesn't look good at all. So Apple Photos removal tool, I mean, it did a good job with the stuff up here in the sky because it was a nice soft background, but over the bush there where it's a little bit more of a complex background, it didn't do a good job of removing that. So wasn't thrilled there. Anyway, moving on. All right, and then we've also got our white point, or I'm sorry, our white balance here. So if you want to warm it up or cool it off, that's pretty simple to understand. Just drag it warmer or cooler. You can also use the point selection tool to, just pick a few spots around the image. Nope, that doesn't look natural at all. If I select in the grass, nope, that doesn't look natural at all. Select on something that's a mid-tone gray or a true white point, and just kind of play with those and see what it does. But the temperature slider here makes a real nice adjustment for you as well. Now I'm gonna cool this off a little bit. Actually, I do want some warmth up there in the clouds, but I like the coolness in the grass down here because it doesn't feel natural if I warm that up too much. Now, the challenge with something like an Apple Photos is this is a universal editor, meaning it's editing everything in the image every time I move one of these sliders. I can't just affect the grass. I can't just affect the tower. I can't just affect the clouds. So that's the problem with a basic photo editor. You don't have fine-grained controls to make selections and separate out different parts of the image. So that's why we'll jump over into Lightroom. I'll show you how to do that in a little more advanced photo editor. All right, curves layer here is something that a lot of photographers will use religiously. They love it. And all this is doing is making a real quick adjustment to those tones in your image. So if I want my mid-tones right here in the middle of the histogram, remember, mid-tones in the middle, highlights, shadows. So I just dropped the brightness in my mid-tones there. If I want to pull up my highlights, make those a little bit brighter. If I want to darken my shadows, I go here. Usually you're going to see an S-curve like this where you kind of peg the mid-tones right in the middle and then brighten the highlights, darken the shadows. And that's a simple way of adding contrast. Now you can see it added a lot of contrast. And that's why I don't use the curves tool a lot myself. I find it's not a real fine-grained control. Again, some people love it and they use it all the time. It just doesn't speak to my soul. It's not the way I like to edit my photos, but it is very powerful, definitely worth playing with and learning about. All right, the final edits that I do before I output my image, either to print or just to share online, would be to look at my hue, saturation, luminance. This is where I make my personal color adjustments to an image, and then any kind of sharpening or definition just to grab people's attention. And we don't want to overdo it. Let's go ahead and start with the sharpening. So if I drag this up a lot, that doesn't even look too unnatural to me. If I say find the large edges, that's what this slider is doing. That looks a little bit more unnatural because it's trying to find the big edges basically in the image. It's hard to explain what that means, but it's trying to find all of these larger lines in the image where it's maybe kind of ignoring the lines down here in the grass. Fall off. Usually this is available in most as well. They're going to have their own recipe for how they like to sharpen the image. Noticed here in Apple Photos, they do a pretty subtle job with all of the sharpening and definition, which is good. It's really hard to overdo it. Usually I go a little bit light on the sharpening because the sharpening is finding all those really big edges. It's trying to grab your attention by focusing on the big details in the image. Something like a definition slider, or in Apple they call it texture. This is looking for the finer details, the smaller details. So I like using the definition. Again, this is one that you can kind of overdo. This looks like it's adding too much clarity. It's separating the black pixels and the white pixels up here. So that one actually is doing a little bit too much. So I might be subtle with that one on this image. Actually, I'm not loving the sharpening overall. It kind of made it look unnatural once I got the sharpening in there. Let's look here at before any edits, after any edits. It does feel like the sun is on just a little bit, which is good. I wanted to brighten up the front of this tower, make it feel like the sunlight is coming from this direction. And, it's a little bit less flat. The original image is kind of flat. There's no real point of interest. You can't tell, what I want you to look at. I think this kind of accomplishes it. It's still a little bit too much for my taste, but this is about as far as I can get it inside of Apple Photos. The one last thing that I would do here is add a little bit of a vignette just to darken the edges a tiny bit, make that real soft. So again, we're trying to draw interest up to this tower here rather than letting people's eyes wander down here into the grass. The grass is kind of interesting, but I don't think it really adds anything. Now, finally, I would crop this in a little bit. I want to get rid of this guy over here that I smudged, and probably the rocks down front. I don't feel like those rocks down in the front actually add anything to the image. I'm cropping those out. I also cropped out the towers over there on the left-hand side because this is my hero. This is my subject. Those towers over on the side added a little bit of context as to where I am, but there wasn't enough of them there to really make it interesting. So that's it. That's my edit inside of Apple Photos. Now let's look at it in Lightroom and see what I can do differently or better over there. I haven't talked about filters because I don't think I need to. Filters and presets are exactly the same thing. It is a good starting point just to give you ideas of what you possibly could do with the image, play around with it a little bit to get you started and send you off in a direction. Let's go ahead and just pick one of those. Let's say I want a desaturated look. No, I don't like that one on this at all. Matte starter. That creates kind of a nice heavy-handed effect. And then I can look over here and see a little bit of what's happening with the photo, and that gives you some indication of, if I like this look, do I want to go that direction? Maybe. I don't really like how it darkened down the face of the tower here. I don't really like the tones in it overall. The feeling in the sky up here is kind of nice. There's nothing wrong with that. Preset is just like a filter that you would apply to a photo on your phone, and it's affecting the entire image. You can buy tons and tons of preset packs and go nuts with them, but I use presets just as a way to give me kind of a starting point as far as some ideas about what I might want to do with the image. If I want to desaturate the sky and tone it like that, yeah, that's a cool look. Maybe I'll come back to that and work on it. But I never leave a filter or preset unless it's just a photo that I don't care to do any other specific edits to. Go ahead and do our edits to this one inside of Lightroom. First off, you'll see it's got pretty much the same tools as Apple Photos, but it does have some more modules. And usually on this one, I'll start at the bottom. If you're following along from that workflow that I gave you earlier, I said the first thing that I do with the photo is I'm going to look for any of the corrections that the software can make for me as far as the profile of the photo. And that's accounting for the fact that you have a flat or a square sensor and a round lens. So it's distorted just a little bit. So when you first pull it in here, you want to check these things if they're available. Enable profile corrections. This is the wrong lens. Apparently the metadata got lost for this photo, so it doesn't know which lens I actually shot this with. I'm going to go ahead and leave it for now, but basically that's what this is telling the photo, that it was shot on this type of camera with this type of lens, and here's how to correct for the aberration. And if you want to mess with that yourself, you can change the distortion, the vignetting yourself here. I usually leave those alone. Usually it does a good job if you've got a profile correction in there. I don't play with anything else down here. The transform, this is if you need to change it. Let's say I was standing off to the side a little bit. I want to mess with that. Vertical transformation. So if it's off just a little bit. Guided is pretty nice here as well. If that's something that you need to use, you can draw lines across it and say, this is my level. And then let's say I want to level it up with another wall, and then it'll level those two up. So there are a lot of fantastic tools in here that you don't have in basic photo editors. And that's really what I use Lightroom for as well. I use this for kind of my basic corrections, but it's capable of doing a lot of different things. Let's go ahead and remove that effect because that's not really helping me right now. Most of this stuff down here, I'm not going to play with. The vignetting, I'll come back to at a later point. Let's go ahead and jump up here to the top. So we're again looking at our basic corrections here. Remember, black point, shadows, midtones, highlights, white point. I like coming back to that. It's worth sticking in your head, I hope. So highlights, we're going to reduce those just a little bit. Shadows, I'm going to bring up just a little bit. And you already noticed, I think, this is making a little bit better edits than the Apple Photos did. Or maybe it's just I'm more used to it, so I know what it's doing in the photo. Now, something that's you didn't have in Apple Photos, if I press Alt on my keyboard and set my black point, you can see there what's showing up is just my true black points in the image. And then same with my white point. If I want to find my true white point in the image, ta-da, right there. Now, if I go too far, you can see it's clipping up there on the histogram. Clipping, meaning the pixels are coming too far over here. And if I turn those on, you'll see that it's telling me whenever I'm clipping. So see how it's highlighting up here saying those are past true white pixels. So pro editing softwares have a few little tricks up their sleeve that help you to do a little bit better job with your photo. I'm going to turn that off because I don't want it to be distracting to me. Next, we're going to jump into the, so those are our basic corrections there. Contrast, I'm going to pretty much leave alone. I actually want to pull that down a little bit because I want to add a little bit of my own detail to it later. I'm going to leave these alone because I don't want to play with my texture clarity. Dehaze is an interesting slider that you don't see in most softwares. That's just basically taking the haze out. And I could go into a long description about what that does. It's a pretty handy slider in a few different cases. Again, Curves tool is right here as well. If you wanted to make your adjustments using the Curves tool, see how it's highlighting for you. These are the tones of the different images or the different tones in your image. So it's kind of telling you right there. So nice handy little tool right there inside of Lightroom. I don't usually use that one. Hue, saturation, luminance. Down here, again, same things that we saw inside of Apple Photos. So a lot of the same tools, but we've got some more fine-grained controls. So that's as far as I want to take it with the universal edits, meaning I'm affecting every pixel in the image. Now we want to look at just doing selective edits. So Adobe has a few different ways to do this. I'm going to go ahead and start with a brush, and I'm going to make this pretty quick. I'm masking, and I've got this set pretty high as far as what I'm affecting in the image, and I'm going to turn on my mask here. So you can see exactly where I'm applying this effect. So everywhere that's red, I'm not actually painting red on the image. It's just telling me this is where you're going to be affecting those pixels in your image. And you see how it's not spilling over onto the rocks. This is a pretty nice masking tool, actually. I do kind of like this one. It's not as fine-grained as what you can do in Photoshop or in a few of the other photo editing tools. But for a basic tool inside of Lightroom, this one actually does a pretty nice job. So, okay, we've masked the grass. Now, whenever I make a slider adjustment up here, it's only going to affect just the area that I masked. So let's turn off that mask so I'm not hiding what I'm doing. And let's turn down the highlights a little bit. I'm going to raise my white point just a tiny bit. Clarity, I'm going to drop because I want to soften it a little bit actually. And then I'm going to bring up my texture, which I know enhances the small details. So I just want to bring up my small details, and I took down my big details. Dehaze, I'm just going to leave alone. That's not really going to do anything for me here. And then you can also tone it just a little bit here if you really want to, which is kind of nice. This is kind of a new thing inside of Adobe Lightroom. I mean, it doesn't do a whole lot for me, but it's kind of interesting. On this one, I just want to drop my saturation a little bit because I don't want your eyes to go down there to the grass. Okay, let's look so far at what we've done to the image. So there's before, after. Now I'm going to go ahead and make those corrections for cleaning up my dust spots on this image. And what this is doing is picking another spot in the photo that it thinks matches that. So rather than averaging it from the pixels around, I can tell it, nope, replace it with this, or replace it with this if I really want to. And it will add that into the photo over there. So I'm just trying to clean up a dust spot. I'm not trying to do something silly. So let's just leave it right there. Press OK. All right. Now let's get a little bit more challenging. We're going to see if it can remove this guy over here. And I have, remember, the ability to select what I want to replace it with. So I'm just going to paint over him. Okay, good enough for now. Now, where is it trying to select? Nope, that's clearly not going to work. So I'm saying replace it with those bushes right there. Yeah, that looks pretty good to me. If I want to make it work just a little bit better. I'm going to soften it. Say okay. It's not perfect. I could go in there and make that a little bit cleaner, but already it did a much better job than what we had over in Apple Photos again. Okay. Basic corrections are done. I've corrected my grass. Now I want to go for something on just the tower, let's say. I'm going to zoom into my tower and make a selection of just the tower. Now I'm going to do this by a radial tool. It means I'm making a selection. I don't know why my Lightroom is running super slow today. All right, let's go ahead and make this selection here. Turn on my mask so I can see the area that I've selected. Now already I can see it didn't make the selection inside of the circle, so I'm going to invert. Tell it to make that selection inside of the circle. Now obviously it's spilling over onto the clouds. So to get rid of that, I'm going to select my brush, erase the mask out here. Make sure my auto mask is checked here so I'm not spilling over. And again, I'm still kind of being quick and dirty, but you'll get the idea here. Okay, I've made my selection of the tower. Turn off the mask so I can see what kind of edits I'm making to it. It's inherited the sliders from the last change I did. So I'm just going to double click on that and zero it out. Let's turn up the lights on the front of this thing a little bit. So we're going to brighten that. I want to bring your eyes into the brightest point in the image. Now I'm going to add a little bit of sharpness to it, just in the small details. Bring your eyes to the sharpest point in the image. My whites, let me see what happens if I pull my whites up. That's not too bad. If I want to change my color temperature just on the tower on this selection, I can. Let's make it dramatic just so you can see where I've selected in this image. Obviously I don't want to do that. That's going to look unnatural. That's going to look really unnatural. But if you want to get crazy, that's how you would do it. Same with any of these sliders really. I'm going to reduce my contrast just a tiny bit because I've added some texture. Add just a tiny bit of clarity. Let's go ahead and back out so I can see how this is affecting that tower in terms of the whole image. Pretty good so far actually. So there's before, there's after. I'm trying to bring your eye into this tower by making it the brightest point in the image, the sharpest point in the image, and reducing my saturation of my colors everywhere else. I'm going to call that good actually. I might take this just a little bit further if I were spending more time editing it. Now, I do want to add a little bit of a vignette to it. And you notice when I did the edit and added the vignette over in Apple Photos, it added the vignette and then I cropped out the rocks at the bottom and the vignette didn't adjust with it. So here again, when you get into a little bit better photo editing tools, I'm not going to go crazy with that vignette. It knows, hey, apply this after you crop it. So if I applied the vignette and then I crop it, it's still going to affect it the way that I want to. So let's go ahead and do that. And then I'm going to go here and crop. Let's say, take out these rocks on the bottom. Move that over just a tiny bit. I do want it to maintain the ratio. So see, it's got the locked ratio here. So I'm not changing the actual size of my image. Get rid of those rocks at the bottom. Okay, and done. And now you can see it pulled the vignette in here on the bottom. So I've maintained my vignette all the way around, even though I just cropped it after I applied the vignette. So another nice little thing just to pay attention to. And these are all little details that you don't really think about when you're first learning to edit your photos, but things that you'll get better and better at as you go along. All right, so we'll call that good for today. So this is my edit inside of Lightroom. Before, after, and had a chance to bring your eyes a little bit more even into the tower and sharpen that, making that really more the point of interest than anything else in the image. And it's a little bit easier to do, I think, in Lightroom too than it is in something like an Apple Photos because you have more fine-grained controls. You can pick and choose which parts of the photo you want to call attention to. In the longer version of this, we get into a little bit more specific edits and some of those zone edits and some of those selective edits that you can do in a more powerful tool even like Photoshop. With this particular image, I wanted to draw attention up to the meadow here in the background and this hut. And then I used these rocks again here in the foreground as sort of a path leading up into the image. Here's the original. And again, kind of a flat image to start with. So I started with some basic corrections. The reason that I did this edit is I wanted to drop the contrast a little bit, knowing that I would add some contrast back in later in the colors, and I would sharpen particular portions of this image. And don't get too hung up on this. I talk a little bit about this in some other videos, but here I don't want to talk about layer masking. Masks are just a simple way of saying, show this, don't show this. So let's hide the mask here, and then I turn it back on, and you can see everywhere that I've painted black, it hides the effect on this image. Everywhere that I've painted white, it shows the effect on this particular image. Masks are a whole separate conversation and learning thing in themselves. I don't want to get too much into that, but this is basically how you do selective edits. Photoshop is how I learned, so I still pass every photo through Photoshop because I know how to use it. Luminar is another one of those basic tools where you can make these adjustments on each of the masks as you apply different layers and different effects, and you can selectively say, I want that to apply to these rocks, or I want that to apply just to this hut here in the background. Looking at the next layer up, I've got several different things going on here. Let's go ahead and turn these off, and I'll turn them back on one by one. So we started with midtones, dodge and burn. Dodge and burn just means I want to accentuate different areas of the image. So I wanted to turn on the lights or brighten the whites in different areas of the image, and then I wanted to darken other areas of the image. So I made that selective edit just in specific areas of the image here where I painted white on this particular layer, and then I did selective color. Selective color, we showed you a little bit earlier, red and white adjustments, and then my green adjustments. I didn't make a whole lot of changes on the masks here to say only apply this to certain areas of the image. After those really different color toning adjustments, I made some very, very subtle adjustments here that you may not even be able to see very much, but this made the photo feel very different to me. So I wanted to add some warmth up there in the sky. So I added this, again, very subtle, but it makes it feel a little bit more inviting up here in the sky over the hut. And then I added a very light color contrast, again, to kind of darken down things here that are outside of the meadow. And then we added a little bit of cool effect in the shadows. Again, very, very subtle, not something you can tell overall. But when we look at the difference from the original image, after I applied all those different specific edits, this is what we ended up with. I'd like to wrap up this basic photo editing video with some common problems that you cannot overcome with photo editing software. So these are things you have to think about when you're capturing your photo. Let's go ahead and just look at a few examples to start with. This one here is the most common problem that you'll have, pointing your phone or your camera directly into the sun. When you get into more advanced cameras and better lenses, you'll be able to create a nice sun star effect with the blades of your lens. But on camera phones and little point and shoot cameras, you don't have that ability. They're getting better and better, but you're still going to have this problem where the sun is usually a little bit blown out, as well as whatever it's reflecting off of, in this case, the water. So this is Ha Long Bay in Vietnam. This is long before I really thought about traveling and making good quality photos when I was traveling. And all I had on me was a little Canon point and shoot, as well as my iPhone 4 at the time. And I really wish I had, had the equipment with me to take a better photo, because I can't really do much with this now. The best I can do is denoise it a little bit and, make it into a black and white image. But there's nothing real strong that I can do with this, just because I lost a lot of the detail up here in the sky. I could crop that sun out, but then that feels a little strange because you don't know where this, this reflection on the water is coming from. So it feels a little bit imbalanced. So yeah, just overall a problem. And this is where we talked about your highlights are overblown. All of those pixels where the sun is, those are just completely white. I can't ever pull back any detail from those pixels. And number one, that's because of the camera that I shot it with. And number two, that's because it was captured as a JPEG. And when it's captured as a JPEG, I lose a lot of information. The camera itself decides what it's going to do with this image, and I don't have the chance to capture all of the raw data that I possibly could and then edit it later. Here again, same kind of thing. This one is in Indonesia. This one I did capture with a good camera, but when I started in on my edit, I pushed it a little bit further than I should have. And I didn't know any better at the time. I thought I was going to be able to recover this information up here in the sky. And I think I do still have the raw files. I could probably go back and re-edit this, but I also did a lot of cleanup on everything down here. I did a lot of cloning just to take some people out that were standing here on the steps. So after I got done cleaning it up, I realized, wow, this sky is really pushed too far. I can't recover anything there, because when I took the photo, the sky was actually starting to turn purple and pink. It was a late sunset and it was looking really interesting. But the way that I captured the photo and started processing it, I lost all of that detail up there. So again, just overblown. There's no information there. And this is one where, again, when I was starting to process photos, I would pull the shadows all the way up because I felt like that was the best way to recover all of these details. But now it feels like the scene is kind of flat because there are no shadows here. Everything is a highlight or everything is a midtone. I'm missing those shadows, so there's no feeling. Like if the sun is spilling through here, there should at least be some shadows over here behind this lion. There should be some shadows maybe on the far side of this temple over here. So it's just understanding the value of light and paying attention to those things when you're there in the scene too. So when you do edit them, you can make an edit that feels natural. Great Wall of China. There's nothing necessarily wrong with this, but capturing this with just a little point and shoot camera that I had on me at the time, I wasn't able to really pull your attention to anything in particular. It's not a terrible image, but the problem with smaller sensors in your phone or in point and shoot cameras is that they just take the average of everything. They don't pick a pixel down here and say, well, this is closer to me, I'm going to focus on this, or something out here and focus on that and then blur this down here. They just take an average of everything that's in front of the sensor and everything becomes an equal amount of sharpness. So if I zoom in down here, this is no more sharp than something up here in the distance. And then everything is kind of noisy as well. So this is just part of the problem of shooting with a basic camera and a basic lens and letting the camera make a decision for you. This one, long exposure night photography. I was trying to capture these star trails in the sky, so that turned out pretty cool, kind of like I wanted it. But down here in the mountain and the trees, that looks like, that's not good. There's no detail. You can't tell anything because I had my high ISO noise reduction turned on. Always turn that off if you're going to do long exposure night photography, which means anything over a couple of minutes. And then the purpose usually of doing long exposure is to smooth things out. So I smoothed out the water. The sky is nice and smooth. I've got a real cool effect going on there. But all of the mountain I lost detail in, all of these mountains, all of the trees, I lost the detail everywhere because it was just too dark. And that's something that I can't overcome again with photo processing software. If I were to shoot this scene now, I would probably do this as 2 separate frames. I would arrive a little bit before sunset and take one photo to get my detail in the mountains here, in the trees, and then I would blend it together later with a frame that was taken just for the sky and for the water. And then I would merge the two in Photoshop. So that's a skill we didn't really get into in this basic photo editing tutorial. That's in the longer one where I talk about the masking and blending different frames together. But that's how I would do it now, because you just can't get that same effect in the sky and also get the detail down here in the mountains. Just not possible. So that's, again, something that you learn just the longer that you get into it. And I wish I had known that when I was there. Fortunately, this is a place that's only 3.5 hours, 4 hours from my house. I could go here, different times a year and photograph this. Here, when you're pulled back, this one kind of looks okay. Another photo that I took when I was first starting, and I didn't realize until later when I pulled it in to edit it that I had all of these moving branches. And it was kind of a windy day, so I didn't turn my shutter speed up high enough to capture those trees not moving. So the wind was blowing them just a little bit. I had my shutter speed just low enough that those branches were moving with the wind. And you can tell that obviously here with the way that the trees are not aligned, and obviously just all of the blur in the branches, nothing is sharp. So that's not something that I can recover in post either. Even as good as software has gotten, and there are some recovery softwares that will recover things that are out of focus or moving just slightly, but that's beyond what any software can recover. So that's one of those lessons learned that's just in the back of my head. Hey, if it's windy and there are trees and there are branches here, I've got to set my shutter speed high enough that I'll freeze those in movement while the wind is blowing them. Okay, let's look at one last example here. And these boats from Ghana, Africa are something that we've looked at before. The problem with this photo is that the sky is overblown. There's no detail there. It's all highlights. But you've seen in my previous edits that there were some nice clouds up here in the sky. I didn't add those afterwards. There are some softwares where you can do that, but this was all just one photo. So let's see if I can pull up any of that detail up there in the sky. The brilliance kind of works, actually. Brilliance is working a little bit. Contrast, I get a little bit of that back, but here's the problem. I can get a little bit of that back up there in the sky, but now my boats are all washed out. So I can't make separate edits for the boats and the sky in Apple Photos. It just doesn't allow me to do that. Let's pull that down a little bit. Brightness, that doesn't really help either. Shadows, I would probably add some shadows or black point to accomplish a little more detail up there in the sky. Nope, that's not even working. What else can I do here? So I could play with this for quite a while. Let's try actually the blue curves here. Let's just pull down some of the highlights. Still nothing. Meh. All right, let's pull this way down. Hey, look, I've got some pop art feel going on here. That's not what I'm after at all. It creates kind of a nice cross toning, nice warm, cool or warm effect there. But this is not the direction I wanted to take the photo at all. I just wanted to recover some of the detail up there in the clouds. So Apple Photos isn't quite getting me there. And I know for a fact that I'm editing the raw file here in Apple Photos. I'm not editing a JPEG, so all of the detail is there. But Apple Photos just doesn't quite get me there. All right, we're over here in Lightroom now. Let's go ahead and do a develop on this and see what we can pull out for that information up here in the sky again. So let's go ahead and just start where I normally would with my white point. Yep, I set just my whites, my black point. Okay, so we're just going to find our true whites and true blacks there. That didn't really change anything. Is my contrast going to do anything? Not really. Not going to change anything. Let's leave that alone. Highlights. If I pull down the highlights in the sky, you can see the clouds peeking through there just a tiny little bit. Shadows, yes, no, not too much. And again, I'm making universal edits here, so you can see that everything changing in the sky as well as in the boats down below. Now, here's the slider that I know is going to do the trick. Dehaze, because this is essentially what it's built for, to take the haze out of the sky. And it's okay to add a little bit of that dehaze down front too in the boats. It's not too bad there. Clarity, nope. Clarity's making everything look way too crunchy, so definitely don't want clarity. So what I can do here though is, because this is a zone editor or a selective editing tool, I can select a gradient, put it just on the sky here, and then let's zero out my effect. And I'm going to add some dehaze just to the sky. That's a little bit too much there. I don't like the the extra shadow on the bottom of the clouds there, so let's reduce that a little bit. Reduce my contrast a little bit. I'm going to take my texture up because that brings out the small details. I want to see some of the small details in the clouds there. Let's warm up the sky just a tiny little bit. Whoa, that was way too much. In Lightroom here, I can click in there and just go incrementally as well. So let's just warm that up just a tiny little bit. I don't want to go too crazy with it. 5 is probably even a little bit too far. Just go 4. So I'm going to stop there. We don't need to go with the full edit on this photo. I just wanted to show you the difference between a basic photo editing tool like an Apple Photos and a Lightroom, which is, they're working with the same image. They're both a raw image that have all of that detail there in the sky, but just by having the ability to make one edit for the whole image, which affects the boats here in the bottom as well, and then make a separate edit specifically just to the sky, I was able to recover some of that information up there that looked like it was lost in the original image. All right, that is it for the basic photo editing tutorial here. And if you found these concepts useful, you like my teaching style, the much longer basic photo editing tutorial on the website, that's a paid download, goes into a lot more detail on every one of these topics. I wanted to include this one with the photography refresher exercises, because once you start really thinking about how you want to capture your photos, the next logical step is to think, well, what can I do with these after I get home? How might I process them? How might I accentuate them a little bit further? So hopefully this has given you some ideas to start thinking in that direction as far as what you might do with your photos after you capture them, and then also give you some tips to take into the field so that you know what's possible at the point of capture, so that you can be even a little bit more creative when you're looking at a scene and trying to break it down and trying to think about how you want to make a truly impactful image from whatever it is that you're looking at wherever you're traveling in the world.